Hello and welcome to my talk on the power of visualization. Visualization or imagery is the process of kind of mentally rehearsing or practicing prior to doing something in reality. So this could be mentally rehearsing the learning of a skill, it could be mentally preparing for a competition. Visualization can be done either immediately before doing that thing as part of your mental warm-up, or it can be a totally separate part of the training program which just kind of supplements your physical training. The main ways in which visualization helps is that it can help with your motor learning, it helps with memorization, and it can also be a really useful aid for improving situation-specific confidence or self-efficacy. Before we dig down into the detail of exactly how visualization works and helps, we need to have a little bit of a basic background understanding of the role of the central nervous system in muscle movement and in motor learning. So whenever we want to move, a certain sequence of muscle contractions needs to happen, and this is all kind of governed and orchestrated by the central nervous system and the brain. When a given movement is repeated over and over again over time, the brain and the central nervous system starts to learn and store the pattern of signals which creates that movement. The body starts to become more well adapted to doing that movement, it starts to become more efficient, and all of that information is stored in the brain as what is called a motor program. Every skill that is learned goes through three key stages of learning. So when we first start to attempt a new skill, it tends to fail quite a lot. Each attempt tends to be very different to the one before, so there's a lot of variability, and it requires an awful lot of conscious thought. You have to really concentrate when you're trying to do it. This is called the cognitive stage of learning, and the reason why performance is so inconsistent at this stage of learning is because that motor program is not in place yet. So the body has not yet learned what sequence of muscle contractions needs to be put in place in order for that movement to become successful. If that movement is repeated consistently over time, the body starts to get a little bit better at doing it, and we start to enter what's called the associative stage of learning, which is where the motor program is starting to take place. There's less failure, there's less variability, but it's still taking a little bit of conscious thought in order to recreate the movement each time. And then again, over many more months, or sometimes many years, eventually we enter the final stage of skill learning, which is when that skill is pretty much mastered, and that's called the autonomous stage. At this point, you should be able to recreate that movement with little to no variability. It's going to be successful almost every time with almost no conscious thought. It's happening automatically. One of the main reasons why visualization is so beneficial for sporting performance is because the way in which the brain and the central nervous system responds to vivid imagery is very similar to how it responds to actual physical practice. So to the brain, there is very little difference between imagining yourself doing something and actually doing it in reality, which means that by doing visualization techniques, we can start to progress a skill from that cognitive stage of learning right the way through to the autonomous stage of learning. Now, I don't personally believe that visualization and imagery should ever or can ever be a complete replacement for physical training, but there is no denying that mental practice is a useful addition to a training program, and it is especially helpful in times and in situations when physical practice is not actually possible. For example, if you're injured. Skill learning is a reversible process, and even if these motor programs are well grooved and well learned, if we then go a few weeks or a few months without practicing that skill, that learning process will start to reverse and will start to unlearn the skill. In times when physical practice is not actually possible, mental rehearsal can help us to keep those motor programs well grooved and maintained, which means that when we are back to training for real, hopefully we haven't lost too much of that skill. Although mental practice is probably not in reality quite as optimal as doing something for real, it is definitely better than doing nothing at all. And by using a good combination of physical practice and mental practice, that's when learning happens at the fastest rate. Another key benefit of visualization is how it can be used to boost our confidence and increase our self-efficacy going forwards into a certain situation. Through imagery techniques, we can kind of mentally rehearse exactly what it is we need to do in order to be successful, but we also just generally increase our familiarity with that situation. Now, humans have kind of naturally evolved to fear the unknown, so the more we can increase our familiarity with the situation which we're heading towards, the less anxiety that situation will actually cause us in reality, and the less anxious we're feeling, the more likely it is that we are to perform well. Me personally, I have used visualization techniques in the build-up to every competition which I've done in the last 5 or 6 years or so, and I found it really, really beneficial in terms of managing my anxiety and my nervousness on the day, and making sure that I can deliver the best performance that I am capable of in the moment that I need to. Imagery can have one of two main focuses. It can either be task orientated or focused on the process which is required in order to be successful, or it can be focused purely on the end result and the outcome and the success itself. So for example, in the build up to a competition, we might choose to use task orientated imagery in order to really focus in on the technical aspects of the skills which we need to do in order to be successful at that competition. Or we might choose to use ego-orientated imagery in order to kind of explore the feelings and the thoughts and the emotions which success might actually bring us. Both methods have got their benefits and their uses depending on the situation which you find yourself in. So task-oriented imagery is by far the superior in terms of improving actual motor learning, because you're focusing on the actual skills themselves. So if there are skills or tasks which you need to do during that event which you can't do very consistently and very proficiently during your physical practice, then task-orientated imagery might help you to become more consistent and become more proficient with those skills. However, if all of the hard work has been done and you don't necessarily need any more physical practice with your routines and the skills which you need to do, then you might benefit a little bit more from outcome-focused imagery, simply to calm your mind, increase your motivation, reduce your anxiety, and give you the situation-specific confidence which you need, which will indirectly boost your performance anyway. Regardless of whether an image is task or ego-oriented, there will be three kind of key aspects to consider of that image. So that is the visual cues, or what you're likely to be able to see, the kinesthetic cues, or what you can physically feel whilst you're performing, and then there's the emotional cues as well. If you wanted to isolate and just practice the visual and the emotional side of the performance, you could do that by kind of almost entering a meditative state. Close your eyes, be calm, be still, and just run through the performance in your mind's eye. If you wanted to focus a little more on the kinesthetic side of things, you might need to be a little bit more mobile, so you can kind of think and feel what your limbs need to do whilst you would be performing. Using visual and emotional cues can work quite nicely for ego-orientated imagery, but for task-specific imagery, a certain amount of focus on the kinesthetic side of things will be necessary. There is no harm at all in kind of getting your other senses involved and trying to replicate the event which you're preparing for as closely as possible. So as well as visual, kinesthetic and emotional cues, if you really wanted to make your image super relevant and super helpful, you could think about what equipment you're likely to be using, if you're going to be holding anything, what you're going to be wearing, the sounds, the smells, the environment which you're likely to be performing in. Trying to replicate those things as closely as you possibly can will again work wonders in terms of reducing your anxiety and helping you to perform well on the day. Next, we need to consider the perspective of our imagery. So when we visualize ourselves doing something, we can either see it from a first-person point of view, as if we were seeing it out of our own eyes, or from a third-person point of view, as if we were watching a video of ourselves or seeing it from somebody else's point of view. And both of these perspectives have got their own benefits and their own drawbacks depending on the situation. As we kind of live and exist inside our own heads, that internal perspective of imagery can make it more easy for us to take into account kinesthetic cues and emotional cues, whereas if you are viewing something from an external perspective, you're really only going to be able to consider that image from a visual point of view. Internal imagery is also a bit of a better replication of how we experience reality, which will make an internal image a bit more transferable to real life situations. That being said, replicating reality too closely can be a drawback in and of itself. By taking a more external viewpoint, we give ourselves the opportunity to rehearse and practice a skill in a way which isn't even possible in reality, and that might help us to draw attention to different parts of the skill which we don't necessarily pay attention to when we're seeing it from our own perspective. External imagery is also quite helpful for building that understanding of exactly how a skill should look, which ultimately is really, really important for aesthetic sports such as gymnastics, which are judged based on what the skill looks like. The final factor to consider in our imagery methodology is the timing and the tempo of the imagery. So when we're imagining ourselves doing a skill, we can either view it in real time or we can view the skill slowed down. And again, there's pros and cons to each approach. So if we were to imagine ourselves doing a skill slowed down, that could be beneficial in the sense that it gives us more time to focus on the key technical aspect of that skill. Whereas if you were to view a skill in real time, that might more closely represent how we actually experience the skill in reality. It might engage the motor program in the brain in a more natural way, which might make it a bit more relevant to real life performance. Generally, I would say using a slowed down imagery technique would be most important and most relevant to more complex motor skills, or skills which are not yet in the autonomous phase of learning, where you need that extra time to really focus on the technique. And then if the imagery contains a skill which is a little bit more autonomous for you, or if the image is a little bit more ego orientated and doesn't necessarily need that same focus on the fine technical points of the skill, then that might be the best time to view the skill in real time. There's a lot of choices and a lot of considerations to take into account there. But regardless of what type of imagery you choose to use, there are a few kind of golden rules which should apply to any imagery session. So firstly, images must always be relevant to your personal ability level. Using imagery to practice skills which you can already do fairly easily is generally not a great idea, because as we've spoken about already, being able to do a skill really, really well is defined by the ability to not really need to think about it too much. So if we start overthinking that skill, that can lead to this paralysis by over-analysis. That can send it down into a lower stage of learning, and it can start to feel a little bit more like how it used to when you couldn't do it automatically. So generally, any skill which you can do autonomously is best to leave alone. Don't overthink it, and just trust that muscle memory that your body will be able to do it absolutely fine. At the opposite end of that scale, using imagery to practice a skill which you've not even started working on in reality yet is probably not going to be of any help to you either, because if you've not even started to work on it in your physical practice, you're probably not going to have enough of a deep understanding of that move to create an image in your head that's actually going to be helpful for you, because you don't know how that skill feels and you probably don't fully understand how it's meant to look yet. Secondly, you have to make sure that your images are technically accurate, because if you're imagining a skill which is not perfect, then you're just reinforcing any potential bad habits which you might have in reality. Try to have a kind of textbook gold standard image of exactly how each skill should look in your head, and then base your imagery sessions off of that standard. Finally, any imagery which you do has to picture success. Try to avoid imagining yourself failing or imagining yourself getting hurt or anything like that, because that will only serve to reinforce that failure, increase your anxiety, and make you less likely to succeed in real life. To finish off the video, I wanted to show you guys a few clips from one of my own imagery sessions which I filmed a little while back. You will see that from an outsider's point of view, what I'm doing looks kind of ridiculous, but I don't mind doing it, and I don't mind showing it either, because I know that it will be beneficial to my performance in the long run. And I would encourage you to adopt the same mentality if you do start to use imagery. Don't worry about feeling or looking silly, because the important thing is that you are taking measures to smartly optimise your performance. As I had no competitions approaching at this particular moment in time, the session was focused on task-orientated imagery towards specific skills. some of which I could already do and was working to maintain, and some of which are target elements for me in the future. Just a note on my personal preferences and what seems to work best for me. I like to visualise mostly kinesthetically from a first-person perspective with a slightly slowed down tempo. But as we've discussed, there are benefits to doing it differently, so try and figure out what methods you are naturally drawn to and figure out what works best for you. There is no harm at all in experimenting with different perspectives, focuses and timings, as using a wider variety of mental techniques can ultimately give you the widest general perspective on the situations you are rehearsing and can lead to the most optimal performance. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it informative. If you did, please feel free to check out the other videos which I've got on this channel and my other YouTube channel as well. There's lots of informative stuff, tutorials, cool gymnastics montages and all sorts of stuff. So please feel free to check out the other things which I've posted, and please consider subscribing to this channel so that you can catch what I've got coming up next as well. Thank you very much again, and hopefully you will tune in to see the next one.